So Irish Republican rap group Kneecap had their thunder stolen at Glastonbury Festival over the weekend because they, fresh off of praising Hezbollah and calling to assassinate MPs, and then finally being investigated by the police who dragged their heels to do so. Meanwhile, Lucy Connolly is in prison for 31 months for a tweet that she deleted that in no way incited violence, especially not to the scale that Kneecap did. Well, Kneecap, despite, again, glorifying terrorism and calling to start a riot outside their pending trial in Westminster, they were overshadowed by a rap group called Bob Vylan. Now, the lead lyricist of Bob Vylan is called Pascal Robin Foster, a typical middle-class hyphenated surname. He's the son of, I believe, a Jamaican man and a English woman, and he got up and chanted before a Palestine flag and a sort of slur against the native population, saying this country was built on the backs of immigrants. He got up and chanted, "I hear you want your country back. No, you can't have that. Shut the F up." And then crowd surfed to throngs, thousands of white middle-class English people chanting along with him, cheering for their own dispossession in their own country, cheering for ethnic vengeance and anti-white racism directed at them as much as it is against the gammon working class. And he uses the word gammon in his song that was put out years ago. Now, Vylan also went on and chanted death to the IDF. He also went on a spiel about working for Zionists. Turns out that he was represented by the United Talent Agency before they dropped him for this set, of course. And as it's the music industry, there are quite a number of Jewish people involved in the United Talent Agency, and they were a bit uncomfortable about his anti-Semitism, to put it mildly. But what Bob Vylan has revealed is a number of untruths lying at the heart of the post-war project that is post-1948, post-Attlee, Commonwealth era Great Britain. The first is that Britain is a nation of immigrants. Now, Barbara Roche, the Blair Immigration Minister, said this in a speech, I think it was in 2000 in September, at the Institute for Public Policy Research, which was Blair's sort of favourite think tank, and she had appropriated it from John F. Kennedy's book for the Anti-Defamation League, which is titled A Nation of Immigrants, which was published, I think, in the late 50s or the 60s. And this was to build the post-war impression that America was a pluralistic, liberal nation that could unite all ethnicities and religion under the civic nationalist banner of American identity. And this is why, even though he was on the ostensible left, he is famous for the phrase, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." It was an anti-socialist slogan, but it encompassed all of these identities into the conception of the melting pot under the banner of American national identity. And what Tony Blair tried to do is try to reconfigure Britain from being an old world ethnic-based settlement nation into a social contract civic nationalist nation. This is why he instituted the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act and made the civil service neutral or impartial, and this meant that the civil service is now positioned above the government and acts as a kind of permanent bureaucracy that actually governs Britain. That's why he introduced the Supreme Court, and that's why he introduced the concept of British values, which is a kind of creed that anyone from anywhere can sign up to and either be a Brit in waiting, or as soon as their souls touch British soil, as long as they've signed up to the Scout's Pledge of Values, properly codified under Michael Gove at the Department for Education in 2014 as, I think it was, democracy, tolerance, the rule of law, bland, universalist, liberal beliefs. As long as they sign up to that, they are as indistinguishably British as Hengist and Horsa and Henry VIII, even if retroactively our own ancestors didn't live up to that modish modern standard of what it means to be British. Now, point being, this is all built on a fundamental lie. Britain is not a nation of immigrants. It never has been. We have been relatively stable and unaffected by large-scale migration from between the Norman conquests of 1066 and the Second World War. The Norman conquests of 1066, by the way, only ever added about 5% to the population at the time, and their genetic imprint on Britain is only ever about 1%. What the Norman conquest was, it replaced the upper echelons of the governing class in England. So it replaced the monarchy. And this is why you have that famous Kipling poem of a Norman on his deathbed telling his son and bequeathing to him the governance of England, don't mess with the Anglo-Saxon because he's at his plough, he is quiet, but if he is perturbed, you will feel his wrath. And that is because the Normans were vastly outnumbered by the Anglo-Saxons, and they didn't mix in nearly as much as the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes did with the Britons and Celts that were already here in the Roman period when those German tribes migrated over. I think it was in the 5th or 6th century. And then after that, obviously, the venerable Bede decided to write out the history of the English and define them as a distinct people. That was in 731 AD. And then, obviously, Æthelstan, the first king of England, in 927 AD. Aside from that period of 1066 right through to 1945, aside from a handful of Huguenots and Dutch Protestants and a few Jews that were allowed back under, I think it was Charles II and Oliver Cromwell, other than that, Britain has never been a nation of immigrants. The population from 1927 were more than 90% related to the population of 927. We have a remarkably stable stock of families, of ancestry, of people in England before the revolutions in 1948, 1997 and 2021, before the Attlee, Blair and Boris governments, before the 1948 British Nationality Act, which opened up our borders to Commonwealth migration after the HMS Windrush arrived in Essex, wasn't invited, by the way, despite the modern narrative that it was, before the election of Tony Blair, when something happened and the European Union, the expansion of the Schengen zone led to an explosion in the number of migrants when they only estimated it was going to be something like 30,000. It ended up being a few million. And before the Boris wave, post-Brexit, when Priti Patel went against the advice of even the pro-migration Migration Advisory Committee and established an uncapped pathway for health and social care workers to come to Britain, bring limitless numbers of dependents. Zimbabwean workers were outnumbered 10 to 1 by their dependents, Ghanaians 4 to 1 and Nigerians 2 to 1, and obviously set the skilled worker visa threshold for their income lower than that of the average British salary. It was almost at minimum wage level, so it's hardly skilled workers. Before all of those things, Britain was remarkably homogeneous, culturally, demographically. It was a succession of families, a great chain of civilization that passed down an inheritance of culture and custom and land and a sense of belonging from father to son, mother to daughter for over 1,000 years. And so this settlement has been recently disrupted by those demographic revolutions, by Windrush, by Blair, by Boris. And in order to force the British to be accommodating of those unwanted waves of demographic and thereby cultural change and the economic costs and rise in crime associated with all of that, we have refashioned our national mythology to be, rather than Hengist and Horsa, William the Conqueror versus Harold Hardrada and Harold Godwinson, and Henry VIII, rather than those sort of revolutions within England, those battles, those revolutions among the elite governing class, rather than all that, we've acted as if the Windrush showed up as Britain's Mayflower and settled this windswept isle and built the NHS, and ever since we've been a healthcare system with a country attached. And Sam Ashworth-Hayes wrote in The Telegraph recently, because pretty much every party that has governed or hopes to govern has bought into this narrative. I mean, I already mentioned Barbara Roche from the Blair government, Keir Starmer in his recent Island of Strangers speech, in which he now has denounced, but we'll get onto that later. He said that now in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Migration is part of Britain's national story. We talked last week about the great rebuilding of this country after the war. Migrants were part of that, and they make a massive contribution today. You will never hear me denigrate that. By the way, only 3% of the Boris wave are doctors and nurses. and they commit much higher rates of qualifications fraud and medical malpractice than, native and British-born doctors and nurses. And also, only 5% of visas given out every year are to net taxpayers. The rest are net tax dependents, and that includes skilled workers. That includes, obviously, health and social care and NHS workers, because they're paid for by the taxpayer and don't actually contribute back more in kind than they take. So that's a myth. Remember, during the last Conservative government, Michael Gove got up at the dispatch box when he was announcing his definition of extremism, I think it was in March 2024, and said, quote, "The United Kingdom is a success story, a multinational, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith democracy, stronger because of our diversity." No, the research from the likes of Robert Putnam has been in for over 20 years. Diversity has a deleterious effect on social trust, and the only thing that goes up with diversity is staying at home watching TV or going out in the streets and rioting or protesting over sectarian, ethnic, and political grievances. So diversity is at best our entertainment, at worst our downfall, as we can see from Bob Vylan. And then recently, Reform UK, their brand new chairman, Dr. David Bull, decided to say immigration is the lifeblood of this country, it always has been, and that we are an island of immigrants. And when he was pressed on this, he tried to back it up by saying, well, I mean the well-integrated ones like the Jews and the Huguenots. Now, don't get me wrong, those groups have, sure, contributed plenty of things to Britain. I can't sit there and list them all off the top of my head, but I'm sure they have contributed positively. Hey, I've got a bunch of Jewish friends, I work in politics, it happens. However, if they had not come here, if the Huguenots had stayed in France and the Jews had stayed in Europe and not been persecuted by the Nazis, of course, or they had always kept Israel as their own and the Second Temple hadn't fallen, if Britain did not have waves of Huguenot, Jewish, few thousand Chinese immigrants over the years, who are relatively low levels of troublemaking and disruption, right? If they did not have that, Britain would still be a great country. To say diversity is our strength, to say we are a nation of immigrants, to say that it's only because of immigrants we clambered our way out of the rubble and rations of the Second World War, is a slur against the native population of this country. And it is doing the work of stoking ethnic and historical grievances held by the likes of Bob Vylan. And Bob Vylan single-handedly shatters the illusion that the nation of immigrants narrative has worked to integrate people, even who have an English parent, because he clearly identifies as non-English. He identifies as an ethnic minority. He identifies as presumably just black or Afro-Caribbean. And he holds a grudge against the native people of this country. And he is declaring that he sees his music and his political activism as an act of imperial conquest, that he is delighting in the dispossession of the English people of their own land when they have never done anything to him. I mean, they quite literally took in his dad. His mum fell in love with his dad. I don't know if they're still together. They had a son. They raised him in relative peace and prosperity. In fact, the only decline in prosperity and disruption to civic peace has largely been because of the importing of net tax dependents and men from nations that are far more likely to commit violent and sexual crimes than the native population, like places like Jamaica or the Horn of Africa or the Middle East, Pakistan, Turkey, just take your pick. Anywhere that basically isn't East Asia, West Europe, and the Anglosphere. Never contributes in taxes and usually leads to a rise in violent crime. All of that doesn't prompt Bob Vylan to be grateful. It prompts him to buy into the false narrative that Britain is a nation of immigrants, and therefore, like American slaves, even though, of course, Britain has existed for well over 1,000 years with very low levels of immigration, and the Windrush happened in less than the last 80 years, but it's treated like an original racial sin for Britain because the new founding was the Second World War and the establishment of the NHS. He uses that narrative pushed by Blair, Brown, Cameron, Boris, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, and now even Reform, as a casus belli to deprive the English of a claim to their own country. Because contained within that lie are multiple premises. Number one, that the English do not exist as a distinct group. You are just the sort of aggregated mongrels of anyone from anywhere who happened to turn up on this land, which means that you are not the product of a particular ancestry, you're not the product of a particular people who made a set of distinct decisions that other people in other places did not, which led to the consequences of today, which should inspire in you gratitude to uphold all of their sacrifices, to participate in the democracy of the dead, of tradition, as Chesterton said. Instead, you are just an arbitrary atom who's bounced around by the forces of history, and anyone from anywhere who came to this land could have made the exact same set of decisions. Therefore, anyone from anywhere who comes to this land now has not only an equal claim to your country, your heritage, your culture, and defining it, as well as living off of its dwindling largesse from state redistribution, but also because you are not a product of this distinct continuity, you are not entitled to feel aggrieved and dispossessed when you notice a downgrading in your status as a member of the host majority, as David Betts would say. When you notice that your government is legislating to deprive you of opportunities and instead reallocate resources, power, wealth, privilege, status to tribal, ethnic, and religious minorities. When your government is giving millions in private security protections to mosques, when it is inviting the community leaders of various ethnic and religious groups to meetings in Downing Street, when the Charities Act, the Companies Act, the Equalities Act, and the Sentencing Council judicial guidance that very nearly passed until the intervention by Robert Jenrick forced the hand of Shabana Mahmood, when you notice that all of these pieces of legislation essentially commit an apartheid against straight white men in this country, if you notice all of that, then you yourself are a racist because you are trying to draw arbitrary distinctions between people who could have always come to this land, could have always recreated the exact same country, and who have just as much a right to call this country their own as you. That is the opinion of the state. However, that is not the opinion of their foot soldiers. What the opinion of their foot soldiers, like Bob Vylan, is a sort of reveling in you feeling like a stranger in your own home, like you feeling like a second-class citizen in your own country. They carry a lot of civilizational, ethnic, and historical baggage, and they, rather than choosing to recognize our differences and foster friendly relations between peoples, as presumably the Huguenots and the Jews back then did, they choose to pick a fight with us. And because the state is on their side, even though they're accusing the state of being institutionally racist, but they only do that to amass and accrue more power because the state, all of the middle-class leftists that go to Glastonbury have a guilty conscience as liberals because they fundamentally agree with the revolutionary goals of the likes of Bob Vylan. Because they have that guilty conscience, they leverage claims of racism and discrimination against a state that already agrees with them to amass more power, and so their takeover of this country is sponsored by the state. And so this completely shatters the delusion that Britain is a nation of immigrants, that anyone from anywhere could have built it, and that assimilation is, as Fraser Nelson once said, a miracle underway in Britain. No. Imported tribalistic minorities truly believe themselves to be the enemy of the native host majority population. Again, not all, but this is a constant. And they have throngs of useful idiot white leftists cheering them on and passing them overhead as they crowd surf, just as the attendants at Glastonbury have passed a dinghy full of mannequins in life jackets overhead to celebrate the fact that thousands of fighting-age males who market our women and girls filmed without their consent, drunk and in states of undress by Islamic standards, on social media to entice potential predators to come over here. They celebrate the fact that that's happening, even though we know from the Casey report that now some of those illegal migrants are participating in historic grooming gangs that have happened up and down the country. They are celebrating this. They are celebrating this violence committed against the white British because they are white British.